The Dakota wind in the winter of 1887 wasn't just cold, it was a living thing, a predator that hunted the weak, the unlucky, and the unprepared. It howled for 3 days straight, a relentless assault of ice and fury that promised to bury anything that stood against it. And standing against it was Mara Byrne. She was 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, and utterly alone. Her world had been reduced to the threadbare shawl pulled tight around her swollen belly, and the desperate, defiant act of putting one foot in front of the other through knee-deep snow. Every step was a battle, a rebellion against the frozen hell that wanted to claim her, and the unborn child nestled inside her. 6 days. She'd been walking for 6 agonizing days, ever since the cruel Dakota terrain had reached up and snatched her life away. A hidden ravine, a slip of a wheel, and her wagon lay shattered at the bottom. Her only horse, a loyal old mare, lay still beside it, its life frozen away by the cold. Her supplies were a ghost of what they'd been. A few hardtack biscuits that felt like stones in her gut, and a sliver of jerky that tasted more like shoe leather than meat. Inside her womb, the baby stirred, a restless flutter of life that seemed to sense its mother's growing desperation. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She should have been in a warm cabin, the scent of baking bread in the air, a rocking chair by the fire, waiting. Waiting for the familiar hands of a midwife, the comfort of family. Instead, she was here. A ghost in a world of white, fleeing a fate she considered far worse than death. The name of that fate was Marcus Holloway. He had seemed like a savior at first. When her brother Thomas had proposed the arrangement, Marcus was presented as a pillar of the community. A successful landowner, his property stretching across 2 counties, a man of means who could offer security to a pregnant widow. A respectable man. But Mara had learned to see the rot beneath a polished surface. She saw it in the faint, yellowing bruises on his previous wife's arms during their brief courtship. She saw it in the way the poor woman flinched whenever Marcus raised his voice, a flinch so deep and ingrained it was part of her soul. When cholera had taken the woman last winter, the townsfolk had whispered it was a mercy. Mara now understood why. The night of their engagement party, Marcus, slick with whiskey and entitlement, had grabbed her wrist. His grip was a vice, leaving behind the ghost of his fingers in shades of purple and blue that lingered for a week. "You'll learn quick enough what I expect from a wife," he'd growled, his breath a foul mix of alcohol and something dark, something rotten. Especially one carrying another man's bastard. The word bastard had cut her deeper than any blade. Her child was not a bastard. Her child was the last, beautiful piece of William Byron, a gentle schoolteacher with a heart full of poetry and a smile that could calm a storm. Pneumonia had taken him just 4 months after their wedding, leaving Mara with nothing but memories and the precious life growing inside her. This baby was all she had left of love, and she would be damned before she let a monster like Marcus Holloway lay his filthy hands on it. So she'd fled. Like a thief in the night, she stole her own life back, taking the few dollars she'd saved, hitching up the old mare, and disappearing into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the West. Her brother Thomas would be furious, but his anger was a distant fire compared to the immediate freezing hell of her reality. Her plans to find work in some dusty, growing town where no one asked questions had turned to ash, just like the warmth of her last campfire. Now, there was only the snow, an endless, unforgiving ocean of white, broken only by the skeletal fingers of dead trees. Her feet were numb inside her worn boots, a dangerous numbness she knew was the first whisper of frostbite. She needed shelter. She needed it now. Or her child, her sweet piece of William, would never draw its first breath. And that's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the howling wind or the ragged gasp of her own breathing. A cry. It was raw, human, and utterly desperate. A knife of sound that sliced through the storm. At first she thought it was an animal, a wounded wolf perhaps, but then it came again. The unmistakable sound of a man at the very end of his rope. Someone else was out here. Someone else was losing the battle against the Dakota winter. and from the sound of it, they were in even worse shape than she was. Common sense screamed at her to keep walking. Her own life, her child's life, hung by a thread. She had nothing to spare, no strength, no warmth, no hope. Saving herself was a monumental task. Saving a stranger was an impossibility. But as she crested a small, snow-swept rise, she saw him. A dark shape against the white landscape clinging to the jagged edge of an ice-choked creek. The water was running just fast enough to resist freezing solid, a churning black ribbon of death in the white wasteland. He was a young man, maybe 30, his dark hair plastered to his skull. His skin had the waxy, pale sheen of severe hypothermia. His lips were blue. His movements were sluggish, uncoordinated, the last twitches of a body shutting down. Any second now, his grip would fail. He would slip beneath the surface, and the creek would claim another soul. She should have turned away. She should have saved her child. But as she watched him, she saw something that stopped her cold. Even half frozen, even with death's hand on his shoulder, he was fighting. His movements weren't panicked, flailing. They were deliberate, calculated. He was rationing what little energy he had left. This was not a man who had given up. This was a man who understood survival, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of the same desperate, trapped look she'd seen in her own reflection. The look of someone who had lost everything, but refused to surrender their last breath. She didn't think. She just acted. Mara began picking her way down the steep, treacherous bank. The snow was deeper here, hiding rocks and roots. A fall would mean joining him in the water, a shared grave in the frozen earth. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice thin against the wind. "I'm coming!" The man's head turned slightly. His eyes, startlingly clear despite his condition, found hers. She saw intelligence there, and surprise. He had given up on rescue, and then this angel of mercy appears, 8 months pregnant and half-frozen herself, scrambling down a cliff to pull him from his grave. As she got closer, she saw the details. His clothes were well made, quality wool and leather. This was no drifter. His hands, though blue and frozen, were soft. Not the calloused hands of a working man. He was a gentleman. What in God's name was a gentleman doing alone, dying in the middle of the Dakota wilderness? Strapped across his chest was a heavy leather satchel, waterlogged but secure. Whatever was inside, it was important enough to cling to, even in the face of death. "Can you grab my hand?" she yelled, reaching the edge of the ice. He nodded weakly, his arm trembling as he extended it. His fingers felt like stone against her skin, but his grip was shockingly strong. This man had a will of iron. Hauling him out was a nightmare. His waterlogged clothes added impossible weight to his frame, and her swollen belly threw off her balance. Twice, the ice groaned and shifted, and she nearly lost him back to the hungry water. But with his last ounce of strength and her raw, stubborn determination, she dragged him onto solid ground. He collapsed in the snow, his body racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 28, with refined features that spoke of good breeding and a comfortable life. A silver pocket watch, its chain broken, had tumbled from his vest. It was elegant, expensive. He tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering too violently. Consciousness was fading. She had risked her life to save him. Now she had to save him all over again. Her eyes scanned the horizon, desperate. And then she saw it. 50 yards upstream, a rocky overhang, carved by wind and time into a shallow cave. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was life. Somehow, they made it. He leaned on her, a dead weight, both of them stumbling like drunks through the snow. By the time they collapsed inside the cave, Mara was at the end of her own strength. But she couldn't rest. She gathered dry twigs and bark, her hands clumsy with cold, and after an hour of painstaking work, and with most of her precious matches gone, a small, hopeful fire flickered to life. As warmth began to seep into the cramped space, she finally got a better look at her companion. He was definitely a gentleman. His tailored clothes, now steaming by the fire, cost more than she earned in a year. A gold signet ring on his finger caught the light. But there was more to his story. As she gently worked to remove his wet clothes and wrap him in her late husband's spare woolens, she saw the other injuries, recent calluses on his soft hands, healing cuts on his knuckles, a fresh, angry scar along his jawline. This man hadn't just been in an accident. He'd been in a fight. He'd been beaten, and beaten badly, before he ended up in that river. The leather satchel offered no answers. Its buckles were frozen solid. She left it, respecting his privacy, respecting the secrets that had almost gotten him killed. For now, all that mattered was the fire. All that mattered was the steady rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the wind howled its song of death, but for the first time in days, Mara felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope. She had saved a stranger, and in doing so, she realized she might have just saved herself. The satchel sat between them, a silent, leather-bound question. For 2 days, the stranger drifted on the edge of the world, lost in fever dreams and half-conscious mutterings. Mara tended to him, a constant, vigilant presence. She kept the fire alive, venturing out into the biting cold for scraps of deadfall, each trip draining her a little more. She melted snow for water and made a thin, weak broth from the last of her jerky, forcing it between his cracked lips. On the second night, the fever broke. This morning, he had opened his eyes, and this time, they stayed open. They were gray, she noticed, the color of a storm brewing over the prairie. And they were sharp, intelligent, and focused entirely on her. She suddenly felt a pang of self-consciousness, aware of her tangled hair, her torn dress, her gaunt, weary face. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a raw whisper, but it was clear. "I believe I owe you my life." The formality was jarring. Even here, half dead in a cave and wearing another man's clothes, he carried himself with an air of command, a man used to being listened to. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. She set aside the tear in his coat she'd been mending. "Though I wouldn't turn down a name, and maybe a reason why you were taking a swim in a frozen river." He struggled to sit up, a sharp wince of pain crossing his face as his bruised ribs protested. "James," he said, after a small, almost imperceptible hesitation. "James Miller." The pause was there. A tiny gap between the first and last name. A lie. Or at least not the whole truth. She let it pass. A man who'd been beaten and left for dead had earned the right to his secrets. "Mara Byrne," she offered in return. "And yes, I'm aware of how this looks. It's not exactly a story that builds a fine reputation." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I find myself less concerned with reputations than I once was, Mrs. Byrne. Circumstances have a way of clarifying what truly matters." There it was again, a hint of a painful past. This wasn't just a man who'd had an accident. This was a man who had been through a crucible, one that had burned away the trivial parts of his life. "It's Widow Byrne, actually," she corrected gently. "My husband passed last winter. Pneumonia." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the sympathy was genuine, clean of the pity she'd grown so tired of hearing. "And I am grateful beyond words that you chose to help a stranger." The baby chose that moment to give a powerful kick, and Mara gasped, her hand flying to her swollen belly. James's eyes followed the movement, his expression shifting from gratitude to sharp concern. "When are you due?" he asked, his voice low. "Soon. A month, maybe less." Time had become a blur during her desperate flight. "Which is why we need to move. This cave won't do for a birthing." The reality of their situation seemed to crash down on him. The fire was warmth, but their food was nearly gone. They were alive, yes, but they were simply postponing the inevitable. He reached for the leather satchel, his movements still careful. There might be something in here that could help. The buckles, now thawed, gave way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers. Legal documents from the look of them. And a map. A small leather pouch clinked with the heavy sound of coins. James scanned the documents, and his face grew dark, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" Mara asked. "Nothing that changes our immediate situation," he said, his voice flat. But it was a lie, and they both knew it. Those papers were the reason he was here, the reason someone wanted him dead. He was not ready to share that secret, not yet. But the map was a different story. It was incredibly detailed, showing trails, settlements, and even seasonal shelters. Someone had surveyed this land with meticulous care. "Look here," James said, his finger tracing a line on the worn paper. He pointed to a small square, about 10 miles northwest of their position. A cabin, marked as a seasonal shelter. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Mara's exhaustion. A cabin with a roof, a door, maybe even a stove. "The journey will be hard," she said, her voice practical, pushing down the hope. "In this snow, on foot, for me, it might be impossible." "It's better than staying here," James said, his gaze firm. "It's our only chance." Over the next few hours they planned, and as they did, Mara saw another side of the gentleman. He knew about wilderness survival. He knew how to read the clouds for weather signs, how to conserve energy, how to pack their few belongings for maximum efficiency. "You've done this before," she observed, watching him. "I've had reason to learn quickly," he replied, and that familiar shadow of pain crossed his face. The man she was getting to know was a contradiction. A gentleman with the skills of a frontiersman. A man with soft hands that had fresh, angry calluses. A man named James Miller, who was clearly not James Miller at all. As night fell, they huddled by the fire, making their final preparations for the journey they would begin at dawn. Mara watched his profile in the flickering light. There was strength in the line of his jaw, intelligence in his storm-gray eyes. And for the first time since William died, she felt something more than just the grim determination to survive. It was a dangerous feeling. It was hope. The satchel sat between them, its secret still locked away. But the man who carried it was becoming less of a mystery. And the more she learned, the more she believed that pulling him from that river might have been the best decision she'd ever made. She was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, two broken people could be stronger together. But she had no idea that the secrets in that satchel, and the man who carried them, were about to drag her into a conflict so violent and twisted, it would make a Dakota blizzard look like a summer breeze. The danger she was fleeing was nothing compared to the danger she had just invited into her life. The world was gray and silent when they left the cave. The wind had died, and the pre-dawn light softened the harsh edges of the frozen landscape. Progress was brutally slow. The snow was a treacherous blanket, hiding pitfalls and tripping hazards. Mara, leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick, had to stop every 100 yards, gasping for breath, the weight of her child a constant, heavy burden. James never complained. He walked beside her, a silent, steady presence, always close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but respectful of her space. "Tell me about your husband," he said during one of their rests, his voice quiet in the vast stillness. Mara found herself wanting to talk about William. The words came easily, painting a picture of the gentle schoolteacher who believed kindness was a form of strength. Talking about him didn't hurt as much as it used to. The sharp agony had dulled to a familiar, bittersweet ache. "He sounds like a good man," James said, his gaze thoughtful. "He was," she replied simply. They walked on, the only sounds the crunch of their boots and their own ragged breathing. Around midday, James stopped dead. His whole body went rigid. "What is it?" Mara asked, her heart jumping into her throat. He pointed. There, in the snow, were tracks. Fresh tracks. Several horses moving at a steady pace, moving in the same direction they were. "Riders," James said, and the word was laced with ice. His hand instinctively went to his hip, to the place where a gun belt should have been. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes, were scanning the tree line with the tense vigilance of a hunted animal. "They could be travelers," Mara offered, though she didn't believe it. "We stay off the trail," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We keep to the trees." The rest of the day was a tense, nerve-shredding crawl. They moved through the timber, parallel to the main path, every shadow a potential threat, every snap of a twig a sign of danger. James was a different man now. The gentleman was gone, replaced by a hardened survivor. Late in the afternoon, they saw it. A dark shape nestled in a clearing a mile ahead, the cabin, and from its stone chimney, a thin, steady stream of smoke curled into the winter sky. Someone was home. James swore, a soft, vicious curse that would have shocked her coming from any other man of his station. "The riders?" she whispered. "Most likely," he said, his face grim. He pulled her behind a thicket of pines where they could watch without being seen. "We wait. We see who they are." As they settled in for a long, cold wait, the pieces started clicking into place for Mara. The way he read the tracks, the immediate assumption of danger, the phantom reach for a weapon he didn't have. This was not a simple gentleman who'd fallen on hard times. This was a man running for his life. "James," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you, really?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of his past. "I'm a man who made some powerful enemies," he said. "The kind who don't forgive and don't forget." "What did you do?" "I trusted the wrong person," he said, his jaw tight. "My own brother." The pain in his voice was raw, the fresh wound of a deep betrayal. Mara knew that pain, not from a brother, but from a brother's choice, the man he had tried to marry her off to. "Family can cut you deeper than anyone," she said softly. "They know right where to aim." He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of understanding, a shared recognition of a painful truth. He saw a fellow refugee. "Is that why you were out here alone?" he asked. "In a way," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "My brother arranged a marriage for my own good. Turns out his idea of good and mine were very different." They sat in silence as the shadows grew long, two strangers bound by the shared experience of family betrayal, watching a cabin that might hold salvation or death. From this distance, they could see figures moving inside. 3 men, the same number of horses they had tracked. "We can't stay out here all night," Mara said, her voice practical, her body aching with cold and exhaustion. "The baby. I need a roof over my head. I need warmth." James nodded grimly. "I know." "If those men are looking for you, we'll deal with it," she said, struggling to her feet, a surge of defiant energy flowing through her. "But freezing to death out here is not an option. Besides," she added, a weary smile touching her lips, "I have something they won't expect." "What's that?" "A very pregnant woman who looks like she's about to give birth on their doorstep. Men like that, they don't see a threat. They see a woman who needs help." She looked him straight in the eye. "Sometimes being underestimated is the most powerful weapon you have." He stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of admiration in his stormy eyes. Then he nodded. Together they stepped out of the trees and began the long, slow walk toward the cabin, a desperate gamble that would either save them or get them killed. Mara leaned heavily on James, playing the part of a woman at the end of her strength. It wasn't hard. She was at the end of her strength. The cabin door creaked open before they even reached the porch. A big, bearded man stepped out, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his eyes taking in Mara's swollen belly and exhausted face. He lowered the rifle. "Ma'am, you look about ready to drop. Get in here before you freeze solid." They had made it inside. The cabin was warm, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and stew. The 3 men were rough-looking, but their eyes held more curiosity than menace. "Name's Pete Garrison," the bearded man said. "These are my associates, Tom and Dutch. We're just travelers waiting out the storm." "Miller," James said, sticking to their story. "James Miller. This is my wife, Mary." The lie felt surprisingly natural. Mara sank into a chair by the fire, the warmth of physical blessing. The men were kind, offering them stew and asking about her condition with genuine concern. They were exactly what they seemed. Working men, heading for the rail camps. Mara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. James, however, remained on high alert, his body coiled like a spring. As they ate, the conversation flowed. Trail conditions, the weather, prospects for work. Then Dutch, the oldest of the three, with wary, intelligent eyes, spoke. "Roads have been rough," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were fixed on James. "Heard tell there's trouble down south. Some rich family fighting over an inheritance. The Callahans." Mara felt James go perfectly still beside her. "Callahan brothers are at war, from what I hear," Dutch continued, stirring the stew. "Younger one, Marcus, says the older one, James, ran off with a fortune in cattle, got bounty hunters crawling all over the territory looking for him." The air in the cabin crackled. Dutch's eyes never left James's face. "Funny thing," he said slowly, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. "You bear a passing resemblance to the description on the posters, Mr. Miller." The spoon dropped from Pete Garrison's hand, clattering on the wooden floor. Tom's hand moved slowly toward the pistol tucked in his belt. The friendly travelers were gone. In their place were 3 professional bounty hunters, and they had just found their man. The warmth of the cabin turned to ice. The smell of stew was suddenly sickening. Pete Garrison and Tom, the two who had seemed so kind, now looked at James with the cold, assessing eyes of men calculating the value of a life. It was Dutch who held the real power. His gaze was sharp, a surgeon's scalpel dissecting James's every micro-expression. He had been playing them from the moment they walked through the door. "The posters offer $500, Dutch said, his voice flat and businesslike, "for James Callahan, delivered dead or alive." Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the end of the line. A tiny, desperate hope she hadn't even realized she was holding, shattered into a million pieces. But James didn't panic. He didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have. He simply met Dutch's gaze, his own eyes as cool and gray as a winter sky. "The posters tell a story," James said, his voice calm, level. "But not the whole story. The only story I care about is the one that ends with $500 in my pocket," Pete Garrison growled, his hand now firmly on the rifle he'd set against the wall. $500 is a lot of money," James agreed. "But is it enough to get you killed?" Dutch raised an eyebrow. "Is that a threat, Callahan?" "It's a fact," James said. "The man who hired you, my brother Marcus, is not known for his generosity, or for leaving loose ends. What do you think happens to the men who know he hired killers to hunt his own brother once the job is done?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Pete's face. Dutch remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly. James was planting a seed of doubt, a venomous little thought that, once it took root, would be hard to ignore. "He's a rich man," Tom, the younger one, said nervously. "He'll pay what he promised." "He'll pay you," James said, his gaze shifting to Tom, "and then he'll have you shot in the back on your way out of the territory. Dead men tell no tales, and they don't spend reward money." The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken possibilities. Mara held her breath, her hand protectively on her belly. She was a witness, a liability. If they decided to take James, they would have to deal with her too. "You're just trying to save your own skin," Pete snarled. "Of course I am," James said. "But I'm also trying to save yours. My brother is playing a much bigger game than you realize. You're just pawns. And when he's done with you, he'll sweep you off the board." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity drawing them in. "I can offer you something better than $500. Dutch laughed, a short, humorless bark. "What could you possibly offer us? You're a wanted man with nothing but the clothes on your back." James's hand went to the leather satchel at his side. He worked the frozen buckles with steady fingers, his movements deliberate, unhurried. The 3 hunters watched, their curiosity warring with their suspicion. He pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped bundle of papers. "This," James said, laying the papers on the rough wooden table, "is evidence, proof that my brother Marcus forged documents, bribed officials, and stole our family's inheritance. Proof that would not only clear my name, but would put him in a federal prison for the next 20 years. He let that sink in. There's a territorial reward for information leading to the conviction of men who defraud the inheritance courts, James continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A much bigger reward than the one Marcus is offering. $2,000, plus full immunity for anyone who cooperates. The air shifted again. Greed was a powerful motivator, but fear was stronger, and the fear of a man like Marcus Callahan was a cold and heavy thing. How do we know you're not lying? Dutch asked, though the seed of doubt was clearly sprouting. You don't, James admitted. But ask yourself this. Why would a man running for his life be carrying a satchel full of legal documents? Why would he risk everything to protect these papers? He looked at each of them in turn. I'm not just running, I'm hunting. And with your help, I can take my brother down and walk away a free and very wealthy man. And so can you. He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. Or, you can take your chances with Marcus. You can kill me, dispose of my wife. He gestured to Mara, his voice hardening. And the child she's carrying, and hope my brother doesn't decide you're too much of a liability to keep alive. Mara felt a cold dread wash over her. He had just laid out her own fate as a bargaining chip. But she saw the cold, hard logic in his eyes. He was fighting for their lives, using the only weapons he had, words and the dark, greedy nature of the men in front of them. Dutch stared at the papers on the table, then at James's face, then at Mara's swollen belly. He was a smart man, a careful man. He was weighing the odds, calculating the risks. The fire crackled, the only sound in the tense, silent cabin. The fate of everyone in that room hung on the decision of one man. Finally, Dutch leaned back in his chair. He picked up a twig from the hearth and began to clean his teeth with it, a casual, almost insulting gesture. $2,000, he said thoughtfully, and immunity. Guaranteed by the territorial governor himself, James lied, his voice smooth as silk. Dutch was silent for another long moment. Then he spat the twig into the fire. All right, Callahan, he said. You've bought yourself some time. We'll escort you to the territorial capital. We'll see what the governor has to say about these papers of yours. He fixed James with a hard, cold stare. But you should know this. If this is a trick, if you're lying to us, I will personally gut you and your pregnant wife and leave you for the wolves. Are we clear? Relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Mara. But it was a fragile, temporary relief. They were still prisoners, their lives hanging by the thread of a promise made to violent men. Perfectly clear, James said, his face a mask of calm control. The bounty hunters, now turned reluctant allies, allowed them the small back bedroom for the night. As Mara lay on the narrow, lumpy mattress, she could hear their low voices in the main room, arguing, planning. James sat on the edge of the bed, a dark silhouette against the moonlight filtering through the single, grimy window. You were incredible, she whispered. I was desperate, he replied, his voice low and weary. The confident mask had slipped, revealing the immense strain he was under. Are those papers real? She asked. The evidence against your brother? They're real, he said. But the reward, the governor's guarantee, that was a gamble. A huge gamble. A bluff that had saved their lives. For now. He reached out in the darkness and took her hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm, reassuring. Mara, he said, and her name in his voice was a raw, vulnerable thing. There's something you need to know. The man I ran away from. The man you were supposed to marry. Marcus Holloway. What about him? She asked, a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. That's not his real name, James said, his voice barely a whisper. It was an alias, a name he used to conduct business outside our family's territory, to keep his reputation clean. The dread turned to ice. She knew what was coming. The universe couldn't be this cruel, this twisted. His real name, James said, his voice breaking with the weight of the confession, is Marcus Callahan. The world stopped. The air in the tiny room became thick, unbreathable. Mara's mind reeled, struggling to connect the two images. The slick, smiling monster from her town, the man with cruelty in his eyes and bruises on his first wife's arms, and the shadowy villain of James's story, the brother who had stolen his inheritance and sent killers to hunt him down. They were the same person. The danger she had fled was the very danger she had run straight into. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a web, a twisted, sticky trap, and she was caught right in the center of it. That's not possible," she whispered, the words a faint breath in the cold air. "When you told me your story," James said, his voice heavy with a terrible new understanding, "I thought it was just a similar evil. I never imagined he would find you, or that you would find me." He had rescued her from a blizzard, and she had rescued him from a river, but they were both drowning in the same man's poison. "So when I saved you," she began, her voice trembling, "you were rescuing your fiancé's mortal enemy," he finished, the bitter irony hanging between them. "And when I fell in love with you." His words trailed off, but they didn't need to be spoken. He had fallen for the one woman in the world his brother had already claimed as his own property. No wonder Marcus wanted him dead. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about her. A new, terrifying thought surfaced. "The baby," she whispered, her hand clutching her stomach. "He called my child a bastard, but he still wanted the marriage. Why?" James was silent for a moment, the pieces clicking into place in his sharp mind. "Your late husband, William Byron, did he own land?" "A small homestead," she said, "just a few acres, but it had good water rights. And it bordered the Holloway property, the land Marcus bought under his alias." James's voice was grim. "It was never about you, Mara. Not really. It was about the land. Marrying you, the grieving widow, was the easiest way to get his hands on it. Your child would have been his legal heir. He would have controlled everything." She felt sick. Her life, her child's future, had been nothing more than a detail in a cold, calculated business transaction. They sat in the darkness, the full, horrifying scope of their situation settling over them like a shroud. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by fate. They were central figures in a war they hadn't even known they were fighting. The next morning, the fragile alliance held. Dutch and his men were tense, wary, but the promise of a larger payday kept their greed in check. They would travel together, a strange and volatile group, toward the territorial capital, toward a reckoning. For days, they rode through the frozen wilderness. The bounty hunters were efficient, professional, their initial kindness replaced by a cold, watchful distance. Mara and James were prisoners, allowed their own space, but never truly alone. During the long, cold nights, huddled together for warmth, something shifted between them. The shared danger, the impossible truth of their connection, forged a bond that was stronger than fear. They talked in low whispers, sharing stories, piecing together the puzzle of Marcus's treachery. In the midst of the freezing, terrifying uncertainty, a fragile, impossible love began to bloom. It was a love born of desperation and survival, a flicker of warmth in a world of ice, a quiet promise that they were in this together, no matter what. One evening, as they made camp in a sheltered ravine, James was cleaning a pair of rabbits Dutch had shot. Mara was mending a tear in her shawl, her fingers clumsy with cold. "Mara," he said, his voice low, "when this is over, if we get out of this alive, He didn't finish. He didn't have to. She saw the promise in his eyes, the hope for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. She reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was rough with a week's worth of beard, but it was warm, real. He leaned into her touch, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle, tentative kiss at first, a question asked in the silent language of touch. She answered by leaning into him, her hands finding his shoulders, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. The kiss deepened, a desperate, beautiful expression of everything they couldn't say out loud. When they finally pulled apart, the world was a little less cold, a little less terrifying. But their moment of peace was shattered by a sound, A shout from the ridge above them. "There they are!" They looked up. Silhouetted against the dying sun were 5 riders. They were armed, their rifles glinting in the last light of day, and at their head was a man whose face Mara would never forget. It was Marcus Callahan. He had grown tired of waiting for his bounty hunters. He had come to finish the job himself. The fragile truce shattered instantly. Dutch and his men scrambled for cover, their brief alliance with James forgotten. They were mercenaries, and their loyalty belonged to whoever held the most power. Right now, that power was sitting on a horse on the ridge above them, backed by 4 men with rifles. "Well, well," Marcus called down, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "My dear brother, and my runaway bride, how convenient to find you both together. It saves me the trouble of hunting you down separately." His eyes, cold and possessive, settled on Mara's belly. "I see you're still carrying my property. I'll be taking that back, along with what my brother stole from me." "She's not your property," James yelled back, his voice raw with fury. He stood in front of Mara, a human shield. "And this is over, Marcus." Marcus laughed, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the quiet ravine. "Oh, it's over, all right. Just not the way you think." He raised his hand, a signal to his men, and then the world exploded in a hail of gunfire. Dutch and his men returned fire, not out of loyalty to James, but to save their own skins. They were caught in a crossfire, pawns in a game that had just turned deadly. James shoved Mara behind a cluster of large boulders, the only real cover in the open ravine. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, whining through the air like angry hornets. "Stay down!" he yelled over the din. He pulled the satchel from his shoulder and tore it open. "The papers!" he shouted. "If anything happens to me, get the papers to the territorial governor. It's the only way." And then, in the midst of the chaos, Mara felt it. A sharp, clenching pain deep in her belly, a wave of pressure that had nothing to do with fear. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. It couldn't be. Not now. The pain came again, stronger this time, stealing her breath. The baby was coming. Her water broke, a warm gush that soaked through her clothes. There was no denying it. Here, in the middle of a gunfight, with killers on the ridge and untrustworthy allies at her back, she was going into labor. "James!" she cried out, her voice a thin thread of sound in the cacophony of violence. He turned, his face pale with horror as he saw her expression, the way she was doubled over in pain. He understood immediately. The gunfight, the inheritance, the feud between brothers, all of it faded into the background. There was only this, the immediate, terrifying reality of a new life, demanding to enter a world that was trying its best to kill them. Marcus's men were advancing, using the terrain for cover, moving closer. Dutch and his crew were pinned down, their position becoming more precarious by the second. There was no escape. "This wasn't the plan," James muttered, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of an impossible situation. "What plan?" Mara gasped, another contraction seizing her. James looked at her, his eyes full of a desperate, wild gamble. "I was never just running, Mara. I was leading him into a trap." Before she could ask what he meant, he reached into the satchel, passed the precious legal documents, and pulled out something she didn't expect. It was a small, brass signal horn, military surplus from the look of it. "What are you doing?" she cried as he put the horn to his lips. "Changing the plan," he said, and he blew 3 long, clear, piercing notes that echoed through the ravine, cutting through the sound of gunfire. For a moment, everything stopped. The shooting ceased as both sides tried to understand the strange new sound. And then, from over the ridge behind Marcus, came an answer. The thunder of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. A line of riders appeared, their dark coats stark against the snow, their movements disciplined, professional. They swept down into the ravine, surrounding Marcus and his men in a perfectly executed maneuver. On their chests, gleaming in the fading light, were the silver badges of the territorial marshals. Marcus stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "How?" he screamed. "How is this possible?" James stood up from behind their boulder, the small brass horn still in his hand. "You always were predictable, Marcus," he called out, his voice ringing with the authority of a man who had just won an impossible victory. "I've been feeding information to the marshals for months. Leading you here, to this exact spot, was the final piece of the puzzle. I just needed you to show your hand." The fugitive hunted by bounty hunters was a lie. The whole thing had been a brilliant, elaborate trap, and Marcus had walked right into it. The marshals disarmed Marcus's men with cold efficiency. Dutch and his crew, seeing which way the wind was blowing, immediately surrendered, eager to offer their testimony in exchange for leniency. The gunfight was over. The war, it seemed, was won. But for Mara, a new battle was just beginning. Another contraction, the strongest yet, ripped through her, and she cried out, a raw animal sound of pure agony. The world narrowed to the small patch of frozen ground behind the boulder, to James's face, pale and terrified, and the relentless, overwhelming force of her own body. "James!" she gasped, her fingers digging into his arm. "The baby! Our baby! Is coming now!" The victory was hollow, the arrival of the marshals a distant, unimportant event. The world had shrunk to this single, urgent reality. In the middle of the blood-soaked snow, surrounded by armed men and the wreckage of a family war, a child was about to be born. James scooped her up into his arms, his strength surprising her. "Hold on, Mara," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her pain. "Hold on." He carried her toward the marshals, who were now securing a sputtering, furious Marcus Callahan in irons. "Marshal Davies!" James yelled. "I need a doctor! Now! My wife is in labor!" Davies, a grizzled veteran with a kind face, took one look at Mara and began barking orders. But they were miles from any town, any doctor. "There's a cabin," Dutch, the bounty hunter, said, pointing back the way they had come. "The one we found them in. It's not much, but it's shelter." It was their only option. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of agony for Mara. Every jolt of the horse-drawn travois the marshals had fashioned sent waves of pain through her. James never left her side, his hand holding hers, his voice a constant, reassuring murmur. They burst into the small cabin, the air still smelling faintly of their stew from days ago. It felt like another lifetime. James laid her on the narrow bed in the back room, the same bed where their love had first been acknowledged. The contractions were coming faster now, one on top of the other, a relentless, crushing tide. And then, the door to the cabin was thrown open. Two marshals stood there, their faces grim, dragging a shackled Marcus Callahan between them. "What is the meaning of this?" James roared, his face a mask of fury. "He's demanding a hearing, Callahan," Marshal Davies said, his voice heavy with reluctant duty. "Right now." "A hearing?" James spat. "My wife is giving birth." "I know," Davies said, looking deeply uncomfortable. "But he's citing territorial inheritance law. He's claiming that since the betrothal contract was signed, that child," he nodded toward Mara, "is legally his property, regardless of who the father is." The sheer, monstrous audacity of it stole Mara's breath. Even in chains, even defeated, Marcus was still fighting, using the cold, twisted letter of the law as his final weapon. He was trying to steal her baby before it had even drawn its first breath. "That contract isn't worth the paper it's written on," James snarled. "It was based on fraud." "And I am prepared to prove it," Marcus said, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. "But until you do in a formal hearing, the law is on my side. That child is a Callahan asset, and it belongs to me." A contraction, more powerful than any before, seized Mara. She screamed, a sound of pure, primal agony and rage. "Get him out of here!" she shrieked. But Marcus wouldn't be moved. He stood there, in his chains, a devil in the doorway, a smug smile on his face, as she fought to bring her child into a world he was determined to own. The standoff was surreal. In the cramped back room of the cabin, Mara was in the final stages of labor, her body a battlefield of pain and effort. In the main room, a legal battle was raging, a war of words and documents that would determine her child's future. James, his face a grim mask of controlled fury, stood before Marshal Davies, spreading his precious papers across the rough table. He presented the evidence of Marcus's fraud with cold, irrefutable logic. Forged signatures, bribed clerks, a web of deceit so intricate it was breathtaking. Marcus, shackled but unbowed, countered every point with legalistic arguments, twisting the law to suit his own dark purposes. He was a master manipulator, and even in defeat, he was a formidable opponent. "The betrothal contract is valid until a court rules otherwise," Marcus insisted, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "And that contract gives me guardianship of any child born to my betrothed. It's standard practice in property-based alliances." Mara could hear their voices, a distant, angry murmur between the crushing waves of her contractions. She was alone, fighting her own battle, her body working toward the inevitable conclusion. "It's time!" she cried out, her voice raw. "The baby is coming!" James's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. He was torn between two battles, the legal fight for his child's freedom and the physical fight for its life. "Marshall," James said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "if you let him win this, if you let him lay a single legal finger on my child, I will spend the rest of my life and the entire Callahan fortune making sure you regret it." The threat, cold and absolute, hung in the air, and then James played his final card, the one he had been holding back. He reached into his coat and pulled out his father's gold signet ring. With a small, sharp twist, a hidden clasp released, and the top of the ring opened like a locket. Tucked inside, folded into a minuscule square, was a tiny piece of parchment. "What is that?" Davies asked, squinting. "This," James said, carefully unfolding the document, "is my father's true last will and testament, hidden from my brother, to be revealed only in the event of his treachery." He smoothed it out on the table. The handwriting was shaky, an old man's scrawl, but the signature was unmistakable, as was the official seal of the territorial court, secretly affixed months before the old man's death. The will was simple. It disinherited Marcus completely. It named James as the sole heir to the Callahan fortune and the undisputed head of the family, and it contained one final, devastating clause. "It names me as the sole legal authority for all Callahan contracts and alliances," James said, his voice ringing with triumph, "which means I have the power to do this." He looked directly at his brother, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "As head of the Callahan family, I hereby declare the betrothal contract between Marcus Callahan and Mara Byrne to be null, void, and an act of fraud. It is dissolved, effective immediately." The color drained from Marcus's face. He stared at the tiny piece of paper that had just destroyed the last foundation of his world. He was broken, utterly and completely defeated. In the back room, Mara gave one final heroic push, and as the sound of Marcus's defeat echoed in the main room, the cry of a newborn baby filled the tiny cabin. A strong, healthy, furious cry, a cry of life, a cry of freedom. James rushed to her side, his face a mess of tears and awe. He cut the cord with a trembling hand and wrapped the squirming, red-faced baby in a clean wool blanket. "It's a girl, Mara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a daughter." He placed the tiny, perfect bundle in her arms. Mara looked down at her daughter's face, at the full head of dark hair, at the tiny, perfect fists waving in the air. She was the most beautiful thing Mara had ever seen. "Sarah," she whispered, the name feeling as right and true as her own heartbeat. "Her name is Sarah." Marshall Davies appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his weathered face soft with wonder. He looked from the defeated Marcus being led away in chains to the tiny baby in her mother's arms. "I believe, ma'am," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that this is what they call poetic justice." James knelt beside the bed, his hand resting on Mara's shoulder, his eyes never leaving his daughter. He was no longer a fugitive, no longer a man fighting for his inheritance. He was a father. Mara looked from her daughter to the man beside her. They had been through fire and ice, through betrayal and despair. They had started as two broken souls, strangers in a storm. And now they were a family, The cabin was no longer a shelter from a storm. It was the birthplace of a new life, a new future. A future built not on land or wealth, but on a love that had proven strong enough to conquer the darkest of evils. Sarah Callahan had been born into a world of chaos, but she was cradled in a circle of unshakable love. And that, Mara knew, was the only inheritance that truly mattered. 3 months later, the spring sun shone down on the sprawling expanse of the Callahan Ranch. The world was green and alive, the harsh white of winter a distant memory. The main house, a grand and beautiful building that had once been a place of tension and discord, was now filled with the gentle sounds of peace. The gurgle of a happy baby, the soft hum of a lullaby, the quiet laughter of a man and a woman who had found their way home. Mara stood on the wide porch, rocking a sleeping Sarah in her arms. The baby was thriving, a perfect blend of her mother's spirit and her father's quiet strength. Her eyes had settled into the same stormy gray as James's, and she had a grip that promised she would hold on tight to whatever she wanted in life. James came out of the house, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands, and settled beside her on the porch swing. He had taken to his role as head of the Callahan Empire with natural ease, but the title he cherished most was father. "Marshal Davies sent word," James said, his voice quiet. "The trial is over. Marcus was found guilty on all counts. He'll spend the rest of his life in a federal prison." Mara nodded, feeling a quiet sense of closure. The long shadow of Marcus Callahan had finally been banished from their lives. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "How it all ended?" James was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant horizon where their cattle grazed peacefully. "I regret the brother I lost a long time ago," he said finally. "But I don't regret protecting the family I have now." He reached out and gently touched Sarah's cheek. "We did it, Mara. We made it." Later that day, a package arrived from the territorial capital. Inside, nestled in a velvet-lined box, was an official embossed document. It was Sarah's birth certificate. Sarah Elizabeth Callahan, born to James and Mara Callahan, legitimate heir to the Callahan Ranch and all associated holdings. Mara traced the elegant script with her finger. It was all real. The nightmare was over. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear. Sarah was awake, her intelligent gray eyes taking in the vast world around her. "When I pulled you from that river," Mara said, her voice filled with wonder, "I thought I was saving a stranger. I had no idea I was saving my own future." James smiled, taking her hand in his. "And when I opened my eyes in that cave and saw you, I thought I was looking at an angel of mercy. Turns out I was." They had found each other in the heart of a blizzard, 2 broken souls fighting for survival. They had faced down betrayal, violence, and impossible odds. And they had built a fortress of love strong enough to withstand any storm. The great Callahan Ranch spread out before them, a kingdom of grass and sky, but the real treasure wasn't the land or the wealth. It was here, on this porch, in the quiet, perfect peace of a family finally safe, finally whole. It was in the fierce, protective love for the tiny girl in her mother's arms, a child born of courage and hope, destined to inherit not just an empire, but a legacy of love that had conquered all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the tales of survival and unexpected love on the frontier are as vast and wild as the land itself. And you never know what you might find when you're brave enough to face the storm.